Hi everyone, and welcome to Elephant TV. My name is Joe Kobothi. Today I'll be speaking to Ahmed Benchemsi. Mr. Ahmed is the Communications and Advocacy Director, Middle East and North Africa, under the Human Rights Watch. Welcome, Ahmed, to the Elephant.
Thank you for having me, Joe. It's a real pleasure.
Great. I just want to dive us in. Recently, Human Rights Watch has released a very interesting report concerning the Israeli-Palestine question. And just for the sake of our audience, if you could kindly give us a background to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. What has happened in the last 60 years now, 60, 70 years?
I think the main stages is that in 1967, the Israeli authorities invaded Palestinian territories, mostly the West Bank and Gaza. Even though there was an internationally recognized demarcation line or frontiers between the West Bank and Gaza, but Israeli forces has, sat there for quite a long time now, and the territory has been occupied since then. Now, in 2003, Israeli military forces withdrew from Gaza, but actually it's just the ground forces that withdrew from Gaza, but control over Gaza, over the aerial space and various crucial services are still in the hands of Israeli authorities. While in the West Bank, a lot of things happened, but maybe the most notable one, or one thing that a lot of people spoke about because images were there, is that there was a demarcation wall built between the West Bank and Israel proper. However, it's important to note that the demarcation wall didn't espouse the borders of the West Bank, but it went well inside the borders in a pretty transparent attempt to carve out space for settlements. So some settlements are outside the wall, even though they are within the occupied territory. I mean, it gets complicated, right. But the point is, the Palestinian territories are still occupied and still considered occupied, even though the Palestinian authorities have some powers over some aspects of public life. But basically, the whole territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea are still considered under the control of the Israeli authorities. Now, in 1993, in Oslo, negotiations started between Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders in order to lead to peace talks and hopefully reach a political agreement between the two parties. But that political agreement was never reached. Why and whose fault it is? That's a vast question that I will not delve into because it's very complicated political questions that have various interpretations, depending on whether you're on one side or on the other. But as far as I'm concerned, as the spokesman of a human rights organization, what is important for us are the human rights, are how human rights are respected or not respected in the area. Now, there was this general narrative there might be some violations in the Palestinian territories, but these are just symptoms because peace talks have not concluded yet, and when peace will be achieved, then the violations will just disappear. This narrative has been floating in the international conversation for quite a long time, and it was precluded on the notion of temporary, because the occupation was believed temporary. And the end of it should be the ending of the peace talks. However, now it's been almost 30 years since the Oslo agreements, and no peace agreement was ever dealt, and the violations not only have they not disappeared, but they have even deepened, and their scope was extended. So as a human rights organization, what we're saying now is that the peace process or whatever political solution might be found or not found one day, some talk about one-state solution, some talk about two-state solution. What we are saying is that we actually don't care. That's not our point. Our point is the human rights situation on the ground. Even occupation has its laws. Countries have obligations under international law when they occupy a territory. They must guarantee the rights of the occupied people. They must not transfer their population to occupied land, etc. What we're seeing now on the ground, and this is what leads me to this report that we just issued, it's a system of human rights violation that is so wide, so systemic, and so intentional that we actually made the determination, and that's a legal determination, that Israeli officials are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution.
Precisely.
That's a pretty grave, conclusion to get to. And of course, we don't make such conclusions lightly. We work a lot before getting there. We analyzed lots of documents, of laws, of policies. We, of course, did field work. We built on 30 years almost of documentation of human rights violations in the territory. We compared the situation of Palestinians with those of Israeli settlers sometimes who live very near them. And we observed a wide gap between the way the first ones were treated and the second ones were treated. So we did our homework, basically. And that was some quite deep and serious homework that lasted more than 2 years. And in the end, we got to the conclusion, the legal conclusion, that Israeli officials are committing the crimes of apartheid and persecution. Now, what is apartheid and persecution? It's not a slur. It is not just an accusation that is thrown out for the rhetoric value of it. No, these are legal concepts. Some reactions by some Israeli officials or defenders of the government since we issued the report has been focused on Human Rights Watch using the quote apartheid slur against Israel.
Right.
It's a way to deflect on the issue, or to not talking about belittling our work. It's not a slur. It is a legal characterization. It is a crime against humanity defined in international law and under international law, and specifically the International Convention of the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid that was passed in 1973, and the Rome Statute that's created the International Criminal Court in 1998. So these are pretty precise legal definitions. And
Precisely.
How is apartheid defined under those international conventions? Well, it consists of three principal elements. Number one, there has to be an intent to maintain the domination of one group over another. Number two, there must be a context of systematic oppression by one group over another. And number three, there must be one or several inhumane acts against the dominated party by the dominating party. When those three elements exist, are identified and combined, then we are in the presence of the crime of apartheid, which is considered under international law as a crime against humanity. And the second crime that we have identified in this report is the crime of persecution, that basically combines the same elements as the crime of apartheid, but it involves the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights by reason of the identity of the group. Like basically, if you're a Palestinian, if you are born a Palestinian, you don't have the same rights as if you're born an Israeli. You're not governed by the same courts if you live in the Palestinian occupied territories. There's a wide difference between your rights and the way you benefit from protections or don't benefit from the protection of the state, as if you're Israeli. So if those deprivations of fundamental rights are done with a discriminatory intent, and I insist on intent, then that is the crime of persecution. And we found in our report that yes, those two crimes are committed. Those two crimes against humanity are committed by Israeli officials against Palestinians, pursuing to one single policy. And what is that policy? It's a policy meant to maintain the domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians, including from a demographic standpoint, and to discriminate them against them across Israel and the Palestinian territories.
What are some of the gross human rights violations that have been instrumentalized along the lines of persecution apartheid that the report highlights?
To start with, Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and there are 2.7 million of them, they live under perpetual military rule. So Israeli authorities, they impose draconian military rule on the Palestinians in the West Bank, while at the same time they're affording Jewish Israeli settlers living in the same area but in a segregated manner their full rights under Israel's civil law. So you have two peoples living in the same territory. Some are under military rule, the others are under civil law. So that's a clear, instance of segregation, basically. The closure of Gaza, the Gaza Strip, more than 2 million Palestinians live in it. It has been closed for 14 years. Basically, people are not authorized to leave, except on very, very few exceptions, and it's very complicated to be one of those exceptions. But yeah, we can consider it a generalized travel ban on more than 2 million Palestinians. So you have to picture the Gaza Strip. It's 40 by 11 kilometers. It's a strip, like 40 kilometers long and 11 kilometers wide. And it's closed from all sides, from air, from sea, from land. And it's basically an open air prison for the 2 million people who live in it. The permit regime is, even when we live within the West Bank as a Palestinian, to move from one point to the West Bank to another point, you have to obtain permits to move in your own territory, and they are very hard to obtain. There are more than 600 checkpoints and the military staff in those checkpoints, Israeli military staff, can turn back Palestinians without any reason. Sometimes you have a short commute that could be done in, I don't know, half an hour or 10 minutes, can take hours. And it's very humiliating, and they can stop you there without any movement, without any reasons. What else? Admissions committee within Israel. So because segregation also exists in Israel proper, not just in Palestinian territories against Palestinians. Even though Palestinians in Israel have way more rights than Palestinians in the occupied territory, but still they're discriminated against. Some small Jewish towns, hundreds of them actually, they have what we call admissions committee, and those committees have the power by law to exclude Palestinians. Little towns, and they say Palestinians are not allowed to live here, and they can say that by law. So I mean, how more transparent can it be when it comes to segregation? A building, right? It's almost impossible for Palestinians to build homes in the vast majority of the West Bank, because they need a building permit that they never get. Actually, if they build without authorization, their house is destroyed. And not just the new part that they built, but the whole house. So home demolition is a serious issue. Let me just give you a number. Between 2016 and 2017, Israeli authorities issued 100 times more demolition orders than building permits for Palestinians. So basically, the point is to push them out. So that's land expropriation, then the natural resources that are diverted, and you can't go to your own place anymore, which has been stolen from you anyway. You got 4.7 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza that are basically denied civil rights. No freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly. Israel touts itself the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, not for Palestinians, because you don't have basic civil rights.
Why do you think that the international community has really spotlighted what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and really done something about it?
There were a lot of UN resolutions against Israel, but they were never, seriously applied. Now there's starting to be something. The International Criminal Court finally, stated about 1 month ago that it was opening an inquiry within Palestinian on the crimes committed in Palestinian territories. So that's good. We are not the only NGO calling what is happening in Palestine apartheid. Other NGOs did that before, including Israeli NGOs, including the the very respected Israeli NGO B'Tselem. I understand others are going to say it. Amnesty here is working on it. We said it. And so it's, things are starting to change. I mean, it's a huge problem. As I just told you, I just listed several instances of it's discrimination. I mean, it's serious, it's grave. But the international community cannot, avert its gaze and look the other way, forever. It's becoming so serious that it's right there. You can't miss it. And we are contributing to the fact that, people need to open their eyes and call a spade a spade. It's, as I told you in the beginning of this conversation, it was all about the peace process, whether there will be peace or not, whether it's one state or two states. What we're saying is that, hey, let's stop talking about theoretical things. Look at what's happening on the ground right now. It's a crime against humanity.
What do we need to do to the human rights? How do we expand it to be able to not just spotlight these issues, but really expand the conversation? But importantly, really check on human rights violations, not just in the Israel-Palestinian conversation, but across the world.
Talking leads to awareness, and awareness is always the first step in fixing a situation. If there's a problem, the first step to fixing it is recognizing the problem. And we are part of what makes you recognize the problem, is that we document, we provide facts, we provide evidence. Human rights is a set of laws. And when you break the laws, that the very notion of law, what is it? It's a norm and a sanction. The norm is what's written in the convention or the text of law. And the sanction is what happens when you violate that norm, right? So there are a lot of things should happen. So in our reports in general, and in this one in particular, there is not just the investigation and the statement of facts. There's also a whole section of recommendation. And this recommendation section is based upon legal consequences of violating the law. What are those legal consequences? Some of them, there are accountability measures. When the crime of apartheid is committed, then there's a list of consequences that apply for accountability. So we're calling for a UN Commission of Inquiry, to establish facts at an even more official level. We are an NGO, so when we provide facts, it's just our word. It carries weight and influence, but it doesn't carry a legal. A UN Commission of Inquiry that carries even more weight than what we say. So we call for opening one. We call for investigation. Now we go to the legal realm, tribunal. We call states. Well, of course, this is not even to talk about ICC, which in the end will end in a court of law. We're just talking to states and governments. We were saying that they should open investigations and prosecute all those implicated in those crimes under the universal jurisdiction. The universal jurisdiction principle. According to that principle, you can prosecute anyone anywhere if they commit or if they're credibly suspected of committing serious crimes. And of course, apartheid is one of those crimes. Other steps that's very concrete is travel bans and asset freezes against officials responsible for the continued commission of these serious crimes. So they won't be able to travel anymore. The assets in foreign banks will be seized. Arms sales and military assistance to Israel, it should be conditioned on concrete and verifiable steps taken by the authorities towards ending apartheid and persecution. Agreements, cooperation schemes should be all vetted. Trade forms should be vetted to avoid all those trade, agreements that directly contribute to the commissions of crime of apartheid. So you see, the more we're getting into details, the less theoretical we are, and we get it very concrete. And in the end, it would lead to a court somewhere, freezing a bank account of someone, forbidding that person from traveling, and if that person travels, arresting that person and prosecuting them.
In your view, what do you think has been the role of advocacy in really highlighting what's been happening in Palestine?
Well, advocacy is what we do. That's, the Human Rights Watch's methodology is based on three main tenets. Number one, it always starts with the investigation. Then we publish reports with the findings of our investigations. Then the second phase is investigate, expose. That's the talk phase. And that's my job because I'm the spokesman and I do communications. So the second phase is, speak to the world and tell them this is what we found. These are the facts. And the third phase, and that answers your question, is advocacy. Advocacy with whom? With governments, mainly. Sometimes with the international mechanisms, just such as the UN Council for Human Rights, or the UN directly, sometimes, the Security Council, the General Assembly, and also direct talks with diplomatic staff and officials in various countries, asking them to do what's right, basically. But it's not just us, that could be construed sometimes as a little angelic, We're sitting in the official, because for example, we have also recommendations to the Israeli government in our report. Basically, our recommendation is stop committing those crimes. It might sound a bit angelic, like seen from the outside world. Oh, really? Are they naive? Are they going to sit with Israelis and tell them stop committing those crimes, and they'll say okay? No, of course that doesn't happen that way. But then we're talking with other governments. We're talking with the US. We're talking with European governments, which won't necessarily listen to us like this as well. But that's the beauty of democracies. There are various levers that we can pull. We can use the media. We can speak to Congress people. We don't go to court because that's not part of our methodology, but courts can, but we push courts to do things, including by application of the universal jurisdiction principle that I told you about, including at the ICC level. So advocacy is basically putting people in front of, pushing officials to confront their responsibility.
And on that very stimulating and very brief conversation, Ahmed, thanks so much for giving us your time here at the Elephant, and thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe. It was a pleasure, and I'm happy to come back anytime.
Thank you so much.